Anyway, it's great to be here. I've been here for a week and I'm getting used to the size of Texas, but then I'm Australian, so I seem to be able to do that. On the other hand, I'm also English, so I also find Australia a bit big. Anyway, what I want to do today is, first of all, to thank Tanny, really, for, thank CJ too, who's been looking after me beautifully the last 3 months. Big thanks over there. But thank you to Tanny and to CJ and to Steve for putting the word ephemera into my lexicon, because once I started to think about it after the invite came through, I realised that I've been working on ephemera since 1999 when Harry and I did that work on posters of the Cultural Revolution. Katie was involved in as well. And I had never thought of it as ephemera. I mean, I'm very serious about it. Ephemera? It's posters, for goodness sake. And yet, of course, it is, very much so. And since then, I've also worked on various kinds of visual media in cities, and that's where I met Steve, thinking about branding, thinking about the way in which a city might position itself through a logo one year and 4 different logos the next year, thinking of Hong Kong, 5 different logos at the same time, something like that. And of course, that's also very ephemeral, and yet terribly deeply and seriously grounded in the stuff of the cities in question. So, just posters, of course, are very seriously grounded in the stuff of politics and memories of the people in question. So, when ephemera came in, I thought, yep, actually, yes, I do ephemera, but I hadn't realised it. I'm now working, as Lisa said, on a book about children in world cinema, and particularly the migrant child. And to me, that is not so much about ephemera, but of course, once you start thinking about the question of childhood, and if you revisit Benjamin, as I've done, really at the invitation of this meeting, I'm working on ephemera again. So thank you for that, because it's actually clarified a lot of thinking for me, or complicated it. It's done something. Now, what I want to do, I think I've got about half an hour, is that right? Yeah, my paper obviously is too long to read, so I will extract from it, and I've also got a couple of images to help me think through with you what has come up for me once I've started thinking about today. So I'm going to start with a quote from a theorist called Gregory Dart, who is talking about Benjamin. He says, "An emporium of endless delights. The big city is also the home of sheer functionality and the notion that time is money. Not since we were children have we been shown so many things and then told not to touch them." Now, in this paper, I'm trying to argue, I think that's what I'm trying to argue, it's in progress, that the definition of ephemerality is lodged somewhere between memory and forgetting. And the ephemera, of course, can't be entirely forgotten, otherwise we would be in the strange position of discussing an object or a life period which we could recognise as such. So it's on that cusp. It's fragile, but it's solid. It's very interesting and very kind of robust thing, this fragility of the ephemeral. Certain passages of life are ephemeral in that they're both precious and fascinating, and yet their material meaning, their once ours ontological sensations, are not available to us anymore, however much we wish or need to access them. And in fact, I'm beginning to think that it's because the ephemeral is as it is that we invent nostalgia to cope with the loss of such profound memory. Now, the other thing that's come out, of course, is that ephemerality is associated with collecting. People collect so-called ephemera, postcards, old milk bottles, mail badges, beer mats. They do this, presumably, to lay claim to an aesthetic, social or cultural pastness that they miss, or which is just some kind of pleasing release from the functional, where pastness is the drawer that may have been located in their own childhood, or their dreams of their own childhood. This form of collecting is then a reversal of the child's collections of strange treasures. The child is grasping towards a world that they can own and even control, a world that they can use as a foundation for huge and expansive stories and fairy tales of their own devising. In Walter Benjamin's reading of childhood, however, he claims, and this is an extraordinary and exciting claim, that children are forging change through these transitional objects from an adult world that has failed to change itself. So adults and children approximate each other's world through a shared poetics of pastness on the one hand and a promise of the future present on the other. Now, I have tried to go through the question of visuality and forgetting quite a lot. I don't think I've got time to do this now, so I'm going to skip on to I'll come to this, I'll leave the others, we'll get to this in a minute. I just want to come to a couple of filmic examples that struck me. One is, well, first of all, Freeberg's work, Anne Freeberg's work, on driving through LA. In fact, she's quoting someone else's work. And she says, you know, it's like an urban cityscape through a car window. You can only really understand certain cities when you're speeding through them. If you walk, you're not going to get it. Other cities you need to walk in order to get it, and it's on the city. So what she seems to be saying that there's something about this visual or oral demand for attention that copes with distraction and produces understanding. So it's both, again, both about memory and forgetting. Interesting. So the blurring of an image and the view from a speeding car doesn't diminish the specificity of what we see, but rather determines an alternative temporality of focus. It makes us squint into and through an alternative version of clarity. So to see with the blur, one must both accept the unseeable as such, and yet persist in looking. The looker-on, whether singular or collective, pays close attention to what has escaped her vision, although one notes that the term looker-on is rather disassociated from the responsibility of seeing, so it's not the right word, but I haven't found the right word yet. The blur cannot be enlarged and deblurred, and that is its secret. Ephemerality does not offer transparent revelation, but it does grant a kind of temporal simultaneity with the past. The ephemeral is like an utterance that makes sense only through its relationship to some other contingency. And this brought me to, of course, Orson Welles' dying word, rosebud, in Citizen Kane, the name of his little childhood sled, the one he was playing with on the last day he saw his mother. And in film, actually, the ephemeral utterance may be quite explicitly blurred. And this took me to another film, which I hope some of you have seen, the film by Antonioni in 1966, Blow Up. And in Blow Up, a photograph has to be literally and metaphorically blown up, made larger and larger, and then the meaning exploded for its secret to be visible. So on a generic level, that film is a kind of thriller. The film deals with a successful fashion photographer's strange encounter in a park, and his realization through his increasing attention to his own photograph that he has witnessed a murder. But as Colin Gardner argues in a shot-by-shot analysis of the park scene in Blow Up, the depth of the film resides in its articulations of phenomenal and hermeneutic inconsistencies of vision. It is what cannot be seen in relation to what is seen or felt in another register that creates the uncertainty that in turn defines the narration. The purpose of the film is an investigation into the nature of the ephemeral, what can be seen and when it makes sense. I have a long quote from Gardner. I'll just do one thing that he's actually quoting himself from Merleau-Ponty. Depth is the means the things have to remain distinct, to remain things, will not be what I look at present. It is preeminently the dimension of the simultaneous. So in Blow Up, the camera, both that of the protagonist and that of the filmmaker, is the apparatus that tricks and trumps the human eye. The chiasmus between clarity and indistinctness is exemplified, I think, by Anne Freeberg's observation in her work on seeing. One encounters the city best through the window of a car. Her point is that without a frame, the city, and especially that particular city, Los Angeles, cannot really be seen at all. Moreover, it is again a question of depth. The city is not distinct, and it far exceeds one point of view, or any singular phenomenological experience. The same notion, closer to home, closer to Hong Kong, is manifest in Chris Doyle's award-winning cinematography for the Hong Kong-based filmmaker Wong Kar-wai. In a series of films that are all in their way visual essays on the ephemerality of Hong Kong in years surrounding the return to China in 1997, he captures the city's energy, humanity, criminality, passions and eccentricities by occluded framing, blurred sequences, and temporal hiccups. He uses classic depth of field shots, a technique designed to engage narrative complexity, but he also includes sequences where protagonists quite simply cannot see one another, because the structure of the city, the laneways, the escalators, the flats, the windows, restricts their sightlines. Just as subtle temporal narrative disjunctures keep them apart. Yet the more Doyle allows the reflections, colours and outlines of his images to blur the objects and subjects of the shot, the more he reveals the obsessive fears of loss that defined Hong Kong in the mid to late 1990s. In Doyle's work, the city is paradoxically afforded emotional substance through the ephemerality of light shows and carefully edited disconnections. And I think back to my own work on Hong Kong in 2003, where the light show, the nightly light show, which was terrible with light pollution, but very interesting, seems to me now about that as well. I didn't see that at the time, but it makes sense now. And then if we think of Ricoeur's work, Paul Ricoeur's work, Lost in Freud, he talks of blocked memory as forgetful memory. The patient repeats instead of remembering. And filmmakers who seek to create ephemerality, displacement, and forgetfulness are in effect requiring that the spectator, the looker-on, considers the memories that must be hidden from the protagonist and the location. So, as a resting point, one could argue that ephemerality is a state of complexity revealed through apparent incompleteness, trivia, or forgetfulness. This definition coincides with its role in traumatic reworking and trivialized collection of the end of childhood and the beginning of old age, and again think about the Book of Rights, which brings those together. That's for Shakespeare. Ephemerality is about losing one's way in order to access a memory that makes visual and emotional sense, or just relieves one of the pain of forgetfulness. In these works of Wong Kar-wai and Chris Doyle, ephemerality is a mixture of exuberance, poignancy, and detail. For instance, in Daunting Express, there's that bizarre sequence where Fei Wong's character rolls around on her beloved's bed. Remember, he doesn't even know she has access to his apartment. In fact, he doesn't even really know her. Seeking some trace of him. She finds a single hair. I'm sorry I didn't bring the film because I wasn't at work on the system, so I'll just let it. But she finds this single hair and she rolls around in Fei Wong's style, playing with his hair. She's spasming with delight about his hair. And then there's the texture of Maggie Cheung's Zhongsounds, or Qipao in The Mood for Love. And they're not just about period detail, but they're about the specificity, the tacticity, and the embodied temporality of passion and loss. And many people have noticed this in those outfits. The film, as well as the protagonist, mourns the touch of those dresses as the loss of a certain version of Hong Kong itself. Now, taking Doyle back to Benjamin. Instinctively, and through years of experience in artistry, Doyle's eye draws out the very shot that will produce a punctum of memory and emotional precision. A ruffle on a dress for Walter Benjamin, or a pair of hands arranged just so and no other in a photograph from Roland Barthes musing on the death of his mother. In forgetfulness, words, ideas, states of being emerge and disappear from view or attention quickly. Digital comments on deliberately anonymous sites, handwritten inscriptions that mean more in their return than in the original moment of writing. The cinematic event that is deliberately unclear in order to force recognition of complexity. All of these mediations produce the ephemerality of everyday collisions between past and present. These are small discoveries. The unsent postcard found years after the trip away in the leaves of a book. So the love of one friend for another is scribbled onto a postcard in Sydney, but forgotten in the leaves of the book and never posted. The writer's feelings at that particular moment, the thoughts of that sunny day, are gone, but the message on the postcard remains as a trace of both. If the writer herself discovers the postcard after several years, the quality of her remembering will doubtless be quite different than if a third party finds the card and imagines briefly the moment of writing, the person who wrote it, the person who never received the greeting. Looking at that postcard, a daughter realises that the addressee, a childhood friend and cousin of her mother's, died in a UK hospital 3 months earlier, in 2012. Her mother had written the postcard on a once-only visit to Sydney in 2009. a forgotten card that may have been unremarkable to others, has a punctilious irony and sadness for the finder. The card's poignancy arises unintentionally from the miscommunication between old friends now lost to each other, but it pricks the daughter with an intimation of her own childhood, her own mother aged, and her own friends dying. Now, in his brilliant essay on Benjamin, Advertising and Mimesis, Hemelryk quotes, "Children thus produce their own small world of things within the greater one." His quotation refers us to our ongoing status as the children of our parents, to Benjamin's musings on fatherhood in children's literature, and thence to the great Arcades project. Walter Benjamin's voluminous notations on European 19th century life and thought, positioned within the architectural logic of mass consumption. The Arcades has created a huge literature of comment and reflection, which is in itself a form of memory work, given that Benjamin's book was never finished. Every section or convolute requires the interpretative input of the finder, and indeed its hope resides in the politically explosive potential of the child's fantasy. I'm quoting Buck-Morse here. Buck-Morse shows how Benjamin makes a utopian trip out of the double consciousness of adult innovation and fantasy and the child's capacity to dream with the leftovers of the past generation. The inventions and the fripperies of mass culture in one generation become historical consciousness in the next, with the added benefit for humanity, for society, of finding newness in the past and present and delivering change. Quoting quoting Burroughs, he says, "A materialist history," this is Burroughs, yeah, that disenchants the new nature in order to free it from the spell of capitalism, and yet rescues all the power of enchantment for the purpose of social transformation. This was to be the goal of Benjamin's fairy tale. So the theme of the child as a collector in the work thus prefigures the modern adult as a reader of philosophy, as a consumer in a world of advertising, luxury and ephemera, and as a creature of cruelty, retrieved through animal instincts and obsessive memory. Nevertheless, the memory of childhood, retrieved through material objects, through ephemera, allows the adult human and human society to become much more and much greater. Collecting is a form of practical memory, says Benjamin, and of all the profane manifestations of nearness, it is the most binding. He says again, collectors are beings with tactile instincts. Think back to the dresses. This optimism refers to a profound dreaming of the self as a pre-social inventor, not to daydreaming. And it's worth remembering in this regard Freud's dismissal of daydreaming as two-dimensional, and the child psychologist D.W. Winnicott's delineation of playing, dreaming and living on the one hand, and daydreaming on the other. Benjamin wants childhood to stand in as the possibility of change, and that hope is not unusual. Cultural projects and political projects require their children to take up the baton for the future without completely letting go of the past. The differences between cultures are about a matter of degree. How important is the past, and how vital is the future? Benjamin realized that the idealized future of his Arcadian project was not wholly commensurate with the realities and capacities of the everyday child in an actual present. But as the cultural historian of childhood, Mae Pearson, tells us in an essay on the modern child's burden of redemption, Walter Benjamin, I'm quoting, argued that when the dream of an ideal child coincided with the utopian projects of the early 19th century, it represented the desire to redeem the past and to bring this dream into reality within the next generation. End of quote. So the child's role was to collect the dreams of the past and to reimagine them, to realise them, and thus enable actual revolution. Benjamin's insistence on this responsibility does not leave any generation even after they have left childhood, however. So we don't get out of it after we leave childhood. In 2012, in an address on communism and ethics, Susan Buck-Morse insisted that the work of politics was immediate. History is unpredictable, and action cannot settle into a comfortable ism, but must always take place in a time as actual as now. She didn't mention Benjamin then, but his traits and his ideals seem insistent within her vision. Now, in Italo Calvino's account of his late childhood during the 1940s, he tells of an incident where young fascists, or rather boys, recruited to be fascists in Italy, loot in an abandoned French town on the border. Their expedition is a mixture of childish adventure and teenage hooliganism, encouraged by adult criminality. The protagonist has been enchanted by fallen love letters in an empty, looted house, while his cooler friend has taken things away, some for profit and some for face, and some as secret treasures, chosen in a last gasp, perhaps, of childish fascination. Calvino recalls, "Basically, I had been a fool not to take anything. They were not anyone's possessions anymore. He winked at me and showed me his real finds, the ones he cared about and would not show the others. A pendant with a picture of Danielle Darrieux, a book by Léon Blum, and also a moustache curl." Here the disenchantment moves in the other direction. The childish instinct to collect random, beautiful, strange and discarded things is here perverted by war and adolescence into looting. You could still find objects that were worth something, says Calvino's friend. Even worse, the direct involvement of violent adults made the targeting of the discarded objects a form of adult hate work. The commander of the boys shouts out, "Any young man who is here today and does not take something away is a fool. Yes, sir, a fool, and I would be ashamed to shake his hand." His bullying prompts the young Calvino to find a dangerous and transgressive piece of loot, or ephemera. Question: a key to a fascist clubhouse. In stealing that as his keepsake, the very thing which must not be seen as ephemeral, he accounts himself braver and happier than the looters. But in so doing, he also admits that the town's transient status as an emporium of free items for thieves and ephemeral fascination for both him and his friend is based on the violent disappearance of the previous occupants. His immediate nostalgia on finding the love letters has been almost immediately revealed as misplaced and inappropriate. In the 18th Sydney Biennale in 2012, two Chinese artists, Yang Jinling and Jin Ling, exhibited works on childhood. Jin's piece used ephemerality to conduct nostalgia, conducting the black incense. Yang used ephemerality to make a record of children's dreaming. Of the two works, Yang's is the closest to Benjamin's ideal of children bearing the possibility of revolution forward. The installations were located on the Cockatoo Island site. Cockatoo Island is a small island in Sydney Harbour. It's been variously used as a prison island for shipbuilding and is now fairly described as the city's prime location for an aesthetic of post-industrial and post-colonial nostalgia. So it's basically an old prison and an old shipyard that bears traces of misery, both for the workers and prior to that, the prisoners, who were especially often indigenous men, many of whom could not swim to shore, although they tried, where their families were waiting. It's a horrible place, anyway. Substantial quarters were built on the island's highest point for the warden, and later for the chief engineer and supervisors when the island was turned over to shipbuilding. Yang and Jin were each allocated a room for their installations in the island's largest such historic house, as it's now called on the website. You can rent it out, and it's an upmarket cafe as well. One presumes that the curator of the Biennale realised the irony of placing installations about the ghosts of childhood in so-called family quarters, placed specifically to overlook and stay apart from the belly of an island swarming with ghosts of Sydney's indigenous men. In Exuviate 2, Where Have All the Children Gone, Jinnu's piece, which she first made in 2005, she stages a spectral representation of her lost child self, a clothesline hung with two girls' dresses. All the clothes are gauzy, pastel or white, and each one is slightly larger than the one before. They recall the dresses of 5 years ago, Benjamin talks about in surrealism, although here the temporality is indicated by sizing rather than fashion. The dresses do not flutter as they might have done on a clothesline in a courtyard or hanging from a pole outside an apartment window, drying in the breeze with a busy parent nearby. Rather, they're still always already dry and clean, no longer needed for bodies that are grown. The room of ghostly clothes grieves for these many embodiments of the growing child. The work declares that change and development come at the cost of the loss of the child's former corporealities and thus of the child herself. As the artist herself points out, the dresses are like snakeskins sloughed off as the snake passes from one generation to the next. They are precious and ephemeral, to be kept in glass cases or children's treasure chests, or lost to the sunlight. Thus, children's clothes are worn, outgrown, and passed on to new children, new babies, other families, or thrown away, or kept in bottom drawers and handled quietly by parents. Jin Nu's rhetorical question, "Where have all the children gone?" refers to herself, an adult grown from many children, each growth spurt intimating the ephemerality of childhood at every stage and in every special new dress. Yet the work also engages with the larger subject of ephemerality and consumption in contemporary China. There are several points of departure. Literally, the child's dress is clean and fresh and useless, as it cannot be handed down to siblings and worn out, as there are no siblings in the 1980s and 1990s world. At the same time, if the dresses have themselves been handed down from parents and their siblings, there is no trace left of those past lives. Then the dresses are like the skins of Chinese contemporary history. They are the gauze-thin recollections of childhoods that were spent during reform, but which bear little trace of the events of the era, nor of the times which provoked it. In the lost children of Tiananmen, the lost children of the parents' generation, the group Greatly Forward and the Hungry Years, and the Cultural Revolution. This is Jin Nu's statement. Now, Yang Junling, born 1981's piece, is called Class in a Class from 2011. It stages a classroom scene in which children's schoolbook graffiti, and it's a whole classroom that he makes, is collected and restaged as projections in this empty classroom. The careful reveries and doodles of the daydreaming child are superimposed on the books and desks they have left behind. Ephemera superimposed on more ephemera. The piece therefore engages us in reverie, both with the classroom as a space which children pass through on their way to becoming educated subjects of the state, and with their private graffiti, a specific manifestation of childhood disengagement and rebellion. To dream is to change the course of the present, but it is also to be stuck in a classroom, listening to a version of the past and present, whilst doodling dreams of the world outside the window. Yang uses projectors to screen the drawings that start small and then expand all over the text and exercise books laid out on each desk. Dreams of enormous, complicated technologies emerge across the page, the desk and the pencil case, with the child inventor, if you like, imagined as the centerfold of the open book, as a little person with a magic computer, or Marlian with his magic brush, dreaming and drawing. Yang's installation needs to be seen in a longer context of the Chinese classroom. In the same decade that Yang was born and entered primary school, posters of the ideal child were printed up for use as instructive decoration. These became a form of ephemera that linked childhood to the politics of idealism, rather than the right to rebel. In the 1980s, when Yang was doodling in school, these posters contributed to a media sphere dominated by public information, ideological advice, and national development priorities. The child in these pictures is not the child that we find in reveries, quite the opposite in fact. He's focused, attentive, and indubitably present. There is no hint of passing through, no possibility of regret. Yet these same posters, when they re-emerge on the walls of older buildings or in films, or in the markets of modern China, do invoke, indeed, the lost idealism of an earlier generation. Yang doesn't include walls in Class in a Class, but those posters would be hanging on them, or should be hanging on them, had he done so. But perhaps that would have complicated the message more than offering any clarification of the environment Yang wants to evade, given that those same posters too are now the ephemerality of a barely remembered version of another political intensity. Okay, so in conclusion, in Yang's work it might be tempting to describe the doodling child as a daydreamer, slipping away from the child from the classroom into a fantasy world where the teacher could not find him out. But perhaps we should say that the child is dreaming in the Benjaminian sense of making a future out of the ephemera of the present, these textbooks, whilst Yang makes dream out of the ephemera of the child's effort, the graffiti that Yang collects and digitizes for the installation. Following Freud and Winnicott, Dart's Gregory Dart accuses the daydream of trying to console the dreamer, who, even if not marginalized in the way that a child is marginalized by, managed by adult society, is likely to be otherwise marginal or poor, or both. So Dart makes an explicit bridge between the arcade project and the situationists, specifically Guy Debord's championing of the entangled and the eclectic, and thereby imagines the arcades as wonderlands with a dark edge. Indeed, Benjamin's ruminations speak distinctly across time to the modern byways of Chinese consumer culture. The process of Chinese commodification entails a quasi-authoritarian architectural enormity. The 21st century shopping centres of Beijing and Shanghai will dwarf the arcades of the 19th century Paris and Berlin, or indeed the contemporary malls of either city. Nevertheless, these neon-lit passageways of new fortunes and luxurious possession seem related to Europe's illumination, both by the parallel stories of industrial growth and world influence, and through the attendant confusions of a youth facing a form of material freedom attached to the accelerated delay of social responsibility and historical recall.